Today is July 25th, 2024, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When families get started in the academy, new families, they have a difficult time understanding what to do. They'll read through the website, learn about the program, even go through the actual enrollment process, and then they'll wonder, what do we do? Where are the lessons? Where are the videos? Where are all of these different activities and things to do? And there's this expectation that there's going to be this big program of all kinds of activities and resources and so on. And our response to these new students, new parents, is just get to work. Just get to work. And this is really, I think, the biggest difference in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is that there's simply no nonsense. There's no busy work. There's no program. There's no videos. There's no nonsense to deal with. You just study and get study activities done. It's a very efficient program. It's designed to be such. And people who are looking to just sort of entertain themselves with educational activities, they're just going to need to find another program, because that's not what we're doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. We're not trying to fill years and years of time with nonsense. We're not trying to just keep kids occupied and babysit or provide daycare to children so parents can do other things. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy is a study program, a no-nonsense study program. And so, as I said, when families get started, when students get started, and they ask, where do we begin? Where's all the stuff? We tell them, just get to work. Get to actually studying. Get to the actual assignments, and so on. There's no need for all of the wasted time. Now, I posted a talk yesterday where I talked about the classical education movement being a scam, and the real essence of that message was the fundamental problems of modern schooling are perpetuated even when Christians start new schools and claim to start classical schools or restore real education. They just perpetuate all the problems. And the problems, the key problem, the most important problem in modern education is that we have retained structures and practices that made sense 100 years ago, 50 years ago, but don't make sense in 2024. This is the fundamental error in modern schools. They're still doing things that no longer make any sense. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we've just gotten rid of all of that stuff. And I'll explain a little bit to make it clear what I mean. If we go back through history, let's just think practically, think simply and historically about education. The printing press was invented in the 1400s. Just think about practical things with me. The printing press was invented in the 1400s. So before the 1400s, there was no access to books. Before the 1400s, students didn't have books. There were no bookstores. There was no Amazon. Education was not dependent on printed books. Printed books were not even available until the development of the printing press. And even then, they were very rare. Think of the work. I don't know if you've ever seen an old printing press. If you never have, and you have the opportunity to go to Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, here in the U.S., they actually have a print shop where, because they do all of this historical reenactment, and they have an old printing press, and the printer who works there, you can go into these buildings and offices and shops in Colonial Williamsburg, and they'll have historians reenacting all of the old activities, and they can answer questions, they can show you how things work, and they actually do things in the old-fashioned ways. So you can go into the print shop in Colonial Williamsburg, and there's a number of staff members who are there working with an old printing press, and they actually print like newspaper sheets and things like that, just to show how the process worked. But you can see the process, and when you see the process, that every single letter was an individual block that had to be inserted into a frame, and then the frame set into the press and inked, and then every single sheet of paper pressed upon the frame. You can see that even though we can say the printing press was invented in the 1400s, it doesn't mean that books started flying all over the place. Printing was a very costly activity. And the way that it usually worked was that subscriptions were taken before the books were printed. So you would basically pre-order the book. The printer would prepare the printing and then print the number of copies that had been subscribed to. And that's how printing often worked. Sometimes you can get an old book that actually has the list of subscribers inside the front cover. But printing, even though the printing press radically improved convenience in printing and accuracy in printing, it still was not some sort of supplier of books to everyday people. Books were still very, very difficult to get a hold of. Now, when books were not available to students, the method of teaching made the students dependent on the teacher. The teacher had the book, as it were. And the class meetings would literally consist of a teacher reading the book to the students. The teacher would read from the book to the students and then would comment on it and explain it. That's how teaching worked before books were widely distributed, before books became affordable and could be given to individual students. So students would assemble in the classroom. The teacher would have often a handwritten copy of the book that was studied, let's say Aristotle's Reasoning. The teacher would read from the book. Students might either memorize or, if they could, take notes on the reading, and then the teacher would explain, discuss, and comment on the reading. That's why we call lessons in schools, we call them lectures, which means readings. They're not sermons or homilies, they're readings, they're lectures. Even the word lesson is derived from the word reading. But the one doing the reading was the teacher, and the school possessed copies of the books. The reason why students had to travel from their home to the school was because that's where the books were. And even when we were kids, even though, those of you who are over 40 years old, when we went to school, we had textbooks, but books were at school. Books were at the library. We went to the library to borrow books and read books. We went to school, to the school library, and to school classrooms where the textbooks were. The books were at school. The books were at the library. We traveled to the books. That's how school worked. And again, that's after the printing press. After the printing press. And I would say even centuries after the printing press. So when we consider education, we've got to look at it historically and say, okay, there was a day when students completely depended upon the teachers for the content of the books themselves. The teachers read or dictated the text to the students, and the students memorized or at least copied the text, and then the teacher explained the text. We can see this when we look back at the lectures of St. Thomas Aquinas. We have commentaries by St. Thomas on most of the works of Aristotle, and you can see the method of instruction. You could see how they read a little bit of the text. The students would not have the text. They read a little bit of the text and then explain and discuss that text. So that's pre-printing press education, pre-printing press. After the printing press, over time, books become more available, but they're still difficult to come by and expensive. They're not distributed to kids. Wealthy families might have a private library. And this is why when you look back at old wealthy homes, you can see that the library was a prominent part of the home because there was no other place to get books. There was no internet. There was no, book catalog. There was no local library even. And so wealthy people would build libraries in their homes, and they would share them with family members, sometimes with friends or neighbors. It became sort of a public service to develop a private library. And so children in those homes might have access to those books if their fathers had purchased and kept copies of, key textbooks from classical studies or sort of the canon of ancient literature and so on. Children in those families would have access to those books. But that was it. And that's why really so few children were even able to be educated, because they simply didn't have access to books. And as time went on, especially when public schooling began and there was a flood of public money into schools, study resources, study materials became more easily accessible. Not necessarily more affordable, but since the costs were covered by taxes, became more accessible to more students. So that by the time I was in school, the complaint was that we had too many books. We had giant backpacks loaded with 30, 40 pounds of books. And parents complained that lugging around these giant backpacks wasn't good for us. So we had the opposite problem. And then in the 1990s, all of a sudden the internet developed, which was sort of the new revolution beyond the printing press. And all of a sudden we could access all of the content of these study materials in digital text, which weighs 0 pounds and are, always accessible and really don't cost anything because it's just digital files. So the ability to study has radically, almost incomprehensibly changed over the past 30 years with the advent of the internet and all of this digital study material. So we've got all these digital study materials, and yet, and here's my complaint about modern schools, the modern schools are still doing things in ways that are obsolete. They don't make sense anymore. We still have students gathered in schools and gathered in classrooms away from home when all of the content of their studies is available at home. We still have schools and learning organized around teachers when students have access to the content themselves. They no longer need someone to read a lesson to them. They no longer need lessons to be dictated to them. This isn't the 1300s. We have books available for students. They are not expensive. They don't need tax funding to pay for all of the books that are needed. They don't need to lug backpacks back and forth between home and school. All of the study materials are available affordably, conveniently, universally, digitally at home. It makes no more sense why schools are continuing to do the kinds of things that they did 20, 30, 100, 500 years ago. It doesn't make any sense. And so much of the activity of schools really is useless. There's no need for it. We're simply retaining these old structures, retaining these old activities, retaining this old organization, this old order of education when it's not necessary. And so when we come to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, none of that stuff is found. We give our students direct access to the study materials. We give our students direct access to the assessments. And we tell our students, get to work. Read the lessons, study the materials, follow the instructions, complete the assessments, complete the lessons, and move on to the next lesson. There's no need to wait for the teacher. There's no need to sit in your desk staring at the board, wondering what the teacher is going to explain today. If the teacher is sick, we don't have a substitute teacher and lose a day of school. There's no more excuse for students not to work and get lessons done. There's no more excuse. And what we see, what was sort of comical about modern education, is that schools and teachers and parents and students are continuing to act like they're still dependent on all of these old things, as if they can't study unless there's someone who reads the lesson to them or dictates the lesson or brings them a physical book. We have this sort of it's an insincere acting like there are obstacles to study and learning when in fact there are no obstacles. And parents and students just invent them. Now we invent obstacles. We say, well, I don't like screen time. So even though these books, which throughout all of human history were never even accessible to students, now that they're accessible in our living room, now we're going to say that looking at the text of the books is now harmful to us because it's on a computer screen. So now we've got a reason to not study the texts that are in our homes because the screen is now dangerous. And so we invent excuses to justify not studying in an age where there is no longer any excuse for not studying. You don't depend on there being a school available. You don't depend on access to printed books. You don't depend on access to a teacher who exclusively knows the content of the lessons and possesses the only printed copies of the source material. You're no longer dependent on any of those things. You've got access to everything at home, and we're still making excuses why we're not studying. And so it's like all of the excuses have been stripped away, and we're simply left to give an account for how we use our time, what we do with our time, whether or not we study, what we read, what we watch, and so on. There's no more excuse for not pursuing the most sublime studies that have ever been pursued in human history. They're accessible directly to students of all ages for pennies from your own living room. There's no more excuse for not learning. And so when students get started in the academy, they come looking for all of the bells and whistles and activities and dances and circus acts and so on of modern schools, and there are none. We tell the students, get to work. Open your course. Open your first lesson. Complete the assigned study. Complete the assessment. Submit the assessment and move on. There's no circus, no bells and whistles. You simply study and get the work done. You can study many more courses than students can study in modern schools because it's much more efficient. You can study year-round, unlike modern schools. You can study 16 hours a day, 12 months a year. There's no excuse for not making progress in studies that really have never been possible before in world history. And we're going to have to give an account to God for what we do with these opportunities. When we look around in Catholic circles, we find as much ignorance of real studies as ever in history. Even when we look to colleges and universities and to those who would be teachers or authors, we find great ignorance of what would be considered required studies centuries ago. Even priests and bishops haven't had the education, even though it's accessible to all of us. They haven't had the studies, they haven't completed the studies that were required of clergy centuries ago. So there's a ton of material, there's a ton of information, there's tons of activity, tons of school activity, degrees and advanced degrees, on and on. But when we really examine the studies that are completed, they're very, very basic, or they're extremely specialized and narrow. And the core subjects of a historical Catholic study program are neglected. They're ignored. Why? Because they're difficult. They're ignored because they're difficult. So, for example, how many people can you find who have studied Aristotle's Organon, which is the master text of history on the art of reasoning in all of its different branches? How many people have even read Aristotle's Organon? How many people do you know who have read the entire Bible, even though it's available 24/7 in your language at no cost? How many people do you know who have read the entire Bible? How many people have studied the Catechism of the Catholic Church? It was published 30 years ago. How many Catholics over the course of the past 30 years, with 24/7 access to the text of one of the most significant documents ever published in church history, have even read through it one time over the past 30 years? Languages are available to us. How many languages have we studied with access to all kinds of language study resources? And I'm not talking about video programs and stuff. I'm talking about simple access to language textbooks. Spanish grammar textbooks, Latin grammar textbooks, German, French, Italian, Greek. All of these resources available to us. Who studies any of them? And then we've got to ask, with all of these resources available to us, what in the world have we been doing? What in the world are Christians doing if they're not studying these things? They're watching television shows, watching sports, just engaging in leisure reading, video watching, entertainment, and so on, and neglecting all of the opportunities that are available to study. Do you realize we have the writings of the church fathers available to us all freely 24 hours a day? How many Catholics even take a look at the writings of the church fathers? We have access to all of the encyclicals that have written by popes, lives of the saints, history books on every different subject, untouched. Now, we used to complain 30, 40 years ago, we used to complain and say that all of these books sat on bookshelves in libraries covered with dust. We used to joke about books being covered with dust, meaning that no one goes and gets them. No one goes and uses them. They just sit in libraries untouched, collecting dust. And that was criticized because there was so much access to great content, and no one would even crack the books open. How much worse is it today when you don't even need to go to a library to access the content of these books? It's in your house. It's even in your hand. And this is the problem. This is the fundamental problem with modern education and Christian culture. We're all dodging the work that needs to be done, pretending we don't see this giant elephant in the room, and talking about Christian culture and education, all acting as if we don't know what to do, all acting as if we're dependent on something out of our control for us to begin or make progress in our studies. And the truth is, all obstacles have been removed. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we've almost entirely removed all financial obstacles to the most complete and rich program of studies that anyone in history, princes and children of noblemen, didn't have access to the breadth and depth of studies that we have available in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. But we see the real nature of the problem in education. Human beings are averse to learning. They don't want to study. When we ask, how could so many people be ignorant or illiterate in the Middle Ages or through history? It's very easy to answer. Most of them. No one wants to study. No one wants to read. How often do you read? No one wants to read. When we look at students today, we can say that they're not functionally illiterate because they are able to read. But how many of them actually read? And if they do read, what are they reading? Are they reading textbooks written by history's wisest and best men? Are they reading philosophical treatises written by Aristotle or theological works by doctors of the church? No, even if they do read, they're reading nonsense. St. John Henry Newman warned about this. He said, in an age like this where books abound, people will pretend that love of reading is real study, where it's just entertainment. They're not even reading the right books. They're not even studying real academic subjects. And so when you come to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, again, there's no more nonsense. There's no wasting time. There's no busy work. There's no dancing bear teacher in front of the room trying to act like a circus clown to get kids attracted to pay attention. Everyone has direct access to the study materials. Everyone is accountable to study. There's no obstacle. There's no excuse. We don't have some poor kids who don't have books and some kids who do have books, and so teachers have to wrestle with these different... Everyone has access to the same study materials. Everyone has access to their written assignments. Everyone has access to quizzes. The assignments and quizzes can be submitted as many times as necessary to earn perfect scores. And we still find students not submitting work. And they come into the academy and ask, where can I find lesson videos? Where can I find the videos? We don't need videos. We're not illiterate people without books. You don't need the teacher to dictate the content to you. You have access to the study material directly. You don't need to travel anywhere. You don't need to go to a boarding school somewhere, take a train ride across the country to get access to the study. You have access to everything you need for every subject at every level in your own living room. So my message to parents and students is stop making excuses. Stop wasting time. Stop seeking out unnecessary videos and multimedia resources and so on, and pretending that you need these things in order to make progress in learning. You don't. The reason why students were dependent on teachers, living, present teachers through history, was because they didn't have books, or because the books were designed not to be read by students, but to be used by teachers. We can see this if we go back into historical books. We can see this, for example, if we go back into like Ray's mathematics books. We can see that, especially at the early levels, those books were intended to simply provide the content for teachers to use. But when students have access to the books, they can just study it for themselves. And it's the most efficient and most affordable method of studying that has ever existed. And even if there are some difficulties along the way, help is available for students who are working and who actually encounter points where they need to ask for some help. Help is available. But we're not going to set up this obsolete, outdated school environment where the kids all sit in their desk like dum-dums staring up at the board while the teacher pretends that he or she is the gateway to all of the world's information. That's just completely obsolete and unnecessary. And when we see teachers acting like that, we have to ask, what is their actual intention? Why would they be willing to lead students to think that those students are dependent on them for their learning when everything is directly accessible to them? So something's wrong there. I would say that teachers and school administrators often do those things intentionally to make students dependent on them for their own material benefits, rather than teaching the students how to go and study and learn independently. So the answer to the question, where do we begin when you come into the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, is you just begin with lesson 1 and you study the lesson. And if you say, well, what does it mean to study? Don't you think this is the problem with modern education? We don't even know what it means to study something. Study means you read it. Read the lesson. Learn the content of the lesson. Reread the lesson. Take notes on the lesson. Mark down the key points that the author of the lesson is making. Memorize those key points. Close the book and ask yourself, can I recite the content of this lesson that I just studied? If not, continue studying. Review the lesson. Then complete the assessment. Read the question. review the lesson, think about the question, think about the lesson content, and write the best possible answer. That's all that there is to do. There's no mystery. There are no obstacles. It's just a matter of work, and it's work that needs to be repeated lesson after lesson after lesson, course after course after course, and there's no limit to what can be studied because our studies are no longer dependent on access to books or teachers. Our studies today are dependent on whether or not we study. And so there's no more excuse. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we're not going to play games. We get requests all the time from parents. Oh, I need videos. We need this. We need that. We need this. No, you don't. You don't need videos. In fact, videos weren't even available until YouTube was developed in the 1990s. You don't need videos. When you have access to the texts, you do not need someone to read you the book. When you have access to the texts and to commentaries, and the texts have been written so that they can be studied by students directly, you do not need someone to dictate the lessons to you or read the lessons to you. You do not need necessarily a commentator. You need to study the materials and complete the assessments. You need to develop and demonstrate your knowledge of the subject. Those are the two key words we use. You'll see them all over the Academy assignments and things. Develop and demonstrate. Develop and demonstrate. That's the work of study. Develop your knowledge of the subject and demonstrate it by assessment. Develop your knowledge and demonstrate it. The lesson provides the content to be studied. The assessment directs you in developing your knowledge and demonstrating it. There's an article on the Academy website titled How to Study for Mastery. You might want to look it up. How to Study for Mastery. Because again, modern education is so misdirected that no one even knows what it means to study. To study. To take a book and study. To say, I'd like to learn how to knit. So I'm going to get a book on knitting and I'm going to study and learn how to knit. I would like to learn how to play the classical guitar. I'm going to get a book on how to play the classical guitar and I'm going to study the book. Modern people don't know how to study because they have been made dependent on schools that are not even necessary. So we do have to learn how to study and realize that when we learn to study, there's no limit to what we can study, to what we can learn. There's no limit anymore. There's no obstacles. And this is what has fundamentally changed in human history, in our generation. This is what has changed, and this is why education also needs to change. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we have made education accessible to students at home at almost no cost by organizing the best study materials in one place. We've removed the obstacles. Students simply need to study. And the consistency with which they study, the diligence with which they study, will be the only factor that determines what they accomplish in their studies. We can no longer blame teachers. We can no longer blame schools because we're no longer dependent on a local school or whoever happens to be the local teacher. We can go directly to the best study materials. We can read them for ourselves. We can note questions we have and ask for help. We can get help from experienced tutors. We can complete assessments. We can receive feedback. We can resubmit assessments until we earn perfect scores on every single assessment. There's just no excuse. We simply need to get to work, stop making excuses, and make the best possible use of the opportunities that we enjoy in God's providence in our generation. Jesus said, "To whom much is given, much is expected." When we look around, we see a generation, a society where education is almost non-existent. And yet we have access to the greatest treasury of study resources ever available in human history. The Library of Alexandria couldn't compare to what we have available to us in our living room. To whom much is given, much is expected. We need to take seriously the moral obligation that we have to make prudent and diligent use of the resources available to us. Stop trying to pretend that we're all disabled and crippled and can't do anything. Stop trying to pretend that we need someone else to do something for us or to make something easier for us. We've got to realize we've already got it easier than it has ever been in history. And we've got to do the work. So the answer to the question, how do we get started, is very, very simple. You just get started, because there's no more nonsense in education. God bless.